Welcome back to RM Transit and welcome back to another transit countdown. Railway systems are some of my favorite modes of transit, and there's nothing quite like looking at maps of spaghetti bowl looking lines across a city. That being said, there is a very specific type of rail line that has a special place in my heart, and that is the topic of today's video: loop lines. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the world's greatest looping lines, I thought I'd give a brief explanation of what I'm talking about in this video. Loop lines are railway lines that form a complete circle, at least in my books. Essentially, a passenger should be able to get on at one station, ride around the line, and end back at the original station without having to visit any of the other stations more than once. Such lines are also sometimes known as ring lines, or circle lines, or even orbitals. And they generally exist for one of two main purposes. Reason one is to provide an orbital route, basically allowing people to connect from line to line outside of the city center, which in a conventional metro network where you have a bunch of lines converging on the city center, you don't have that. This is super useful for minimizing congestion in the city center, since a large number of passengers probably do want to transfer from one radial line to another. Reason two is to provide a circulator and connector between various lines in the city center. Basically, you can have all of your lines converging in the city center, but those interchange points often will become overly congested. By providing secondary interchange points and another connector line, you can help relieve the primary interchanges. Of course, if you have a circular line in your city center, it can also act as a very useful way of connecting to major destinations, meaning heavily used radials where passengers are coming from outside of the city, or at least further out, can be fully utilized for that purpose, while the circular line handles moving people around the city center. Now, there's an unusual obsession with loop lines in the railway community, and I'm going to try to surmise why. For one, there's a beautiful feeling of completion with a loop line, because unlike a regular line, you can't extend a loop. Not in any way I can imagine right now. Another reason loop lines are so amazing is they provide a feeling of encirclement. Basically, when you're within some looping railway line, no matter which direction you go, you're always going to end up at the line and eventually at a station. And that's a really nice feeling. It sort of gives you a sense that you're in the dense part of the city that actually justifies being circled by rail transit. Of course, circles are also just geometrically pleasing if you like math. They also look great on a map, and transit people like looking at maps. One of the complicated operational things about looping railway lines is that they don't really have endpoints. If you think about it, when a train enters the looping line, it's just going to keep operating in a circle until it goes out of service. And this actually provides both an opportunity and a problem at the same time. If you look at any metro line, they're typically operated as a loop. Basically, trains travel up one track, turn around at a terminus, and return down the other track. A loop. With a looping railway line, typically you see two independent looping surfaces, one on the inside and one on the outside, both traveling in circles but in opposite directions. The issue here is that since you can't just turn around a train to fill in gaps on the other service, you have a lot more headway management to do so that you can ensure your passengers get a constant frequency. It's also worth noting that since trains don't have to reverse at a terminus point, operations can be more frequent and reliable. Now, somewhat counterintuitively, loop lines are often some of the most used in a railway system, at least from a ridership perspective, and that's despite not usually traveling through the exact center of a city. This is because loop lines are so incredibly powerful for connecting people from one line to another, or from one line to a final destination, or for just circulating people. As a very nerdy aside, it's also super fascinating to me how different transit agencies have tried to come up with different ways of describing different services that are operating on loop lines, because when you don't have an endpoint, how are you supposed to describe what the service is? So some transit agencies refer to them as inner circle and outer circle, or clockwise and counterclockwise, or different numbers or letters or all kinds of different things. And I think that's super interesting. One of my favorite approaches is just naming the major destinations that are kind of coming up from the station you're boarding at. And that helps passengers know, hey, if I want to go to station X, I should probably go this way and not that way unless I want to wait an hour. Now, before I get into the countdown that I know you've been waiting for, one final note. I'm using the one system per country rule again. Sorry if you're from Japan or China, but I want to keep this pretty international, and so each country can only have one system that appears on the list. I will do some honorable mentions though. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive into the ranking. This was actually pretty hard because the world has a shocking number of really cool loop lines. Number 5, the Loop. The Loop is an elevated circulator rail line in the center of Chicago, and it's probably the shortest railway loop line in the world. It's just 1.8 miles or around 3 kilometers long. The Loop was created by famous railway financier Charles Yerkes to connect various disparate railways in the Chicago area and create a circulator so that the various railways could interoperate through the center and then send trains back out to the suburbs. The Loop has a total of 8 stations and serves 5 of the different lines on the Chicago L network. You know what to do if you'd like to see an explained on that system. Now, as it turns out, there isn't actually a single looping service, and the track work wouldn't even allow one. And so instead, most services simply use the loop to turn around. Think like a Toronto streetcar, but on a much bigger scale. All of this interconnection culminates at the northwest corner of the loop where there is a 3/4 union. Basically, to quickly summarize what that is, Grand Union is where you have 2 double-track railway lines connecting, and you have connections between all of the various tracks. A 3/4 union is kind of like a Grand Union, but with one of the corners chopped off. It's simple, right? Now, in recent years, the Loop has seen some pretty major enhancements, including a brand new station at Washington and Wabash. It opened in 2017 and has tons of modern features, it's fully accessible, and those are pretty valuable things when your system is over 100 years old. Now, like the rest of the Chicago L, trains on the Loop operate at 600 volts DC on standard gauge tracks, and are up to 8 cars or 110 meters long. Early Chicago L trains actually had their origins in streetcar technology. We've really come full circle here. Circle puns. Anyways, you can really see the streetcar origins of the trains in the tight curves on the Loop, which are almost as tight as the tightest curves you see on modern light rail networks. And if there's one thing that stands out about the Loop, I wouldn't even say it's necessarily the infrastructure, but the cultural impact, which is something you don't get to say about a transit system all too often. The Loop is so important to Chicago that the central downtown area encircled by it is literally just known as the Loop, which is so cool. Number 4 is Beijing Line 2, and it's one of the oldest subway lines in China, opening in 1984. That said, this is still nearly a century after the Loop opened in Chicago, and that really puts things into perspective. Line 2 was originally more of an inverted U shape, but it took over the original city center segment of Beijing Line 1, creating a beautiful, very rectangular loop. The line is 23 kilometers or 14.5 miles long and has 18 stations. As it turns out, Line 2 encircles the ancient Beijing inner city. And this means that most of its stations are named after gates into that ancient city. The line is incredibly well used, with historic ridership numbers as high as 1.5 million per day. To put that into perspective, that's twice as much as the Chicago L. Not one line, the entire system, on one line in Beijing. What's perhaps most impressive is that all of this is achieved with 6-car B-class trains. If you're wondering what that is, check out my video up here. These trains operate on a 750 volt DC third rail and on standard gauge because of course they do. What's perhaps even crazier, and I'm teetering on violating my 1 line per country rule here, Beijing has a second ring line outside of its original ring line known as Line 10. Line 10 first opened for the 2008 Olympics, and it is even more heavily used than Line 2. Line 10 covers 45 stations over around 60 kilometers of track, and to be honest, it was a real toss-up whether I would talk about it or Line 2, but Line 2 won out because it is more historic and older, and I think that's interesting. For number 3, we're headed thousands of kilometers away to London, whose Circle Line is the oldest looping transit line in the world as far as I can tell, with an initial completion date in 1884, literally 100 years before Beijing Line 2 would open. The line actually utilizes portions of the Metropolitan Railway, which is the oldest underground line in the world. The Circle Line has a total of 27 stations over 20 kilometers of track, which is 12.5 miles. Though, before you comment, its circliness has been diminishing over the years. The line now operates as a fake circle, starting off in the west at Hammersmith, looping around, and then returning to Edgware Road, where trains turn around just like they would on a perfectly straight metro line and return back to Hammersmith. Also interesting, large portions, basically the entire Circle Line, shares tracks with other London subsurface tube lines, which I think is pretty interesting, but it does make it less of a pure looping line, which is a little sad. Let's move on to number 2. As it turns out, number 2 is also Europe, not too far away, and it's actually in Berlin, with the Ringbahn, which actually might be my favorite transit line name out there, though there's not that much competition. The Ringbahn is a regional rail or S-Bahn loop that encircles the central area of Berlin with 37 kilometers of track, which is 23 miles. That makes it the longest line in this top 10 list. Somewhat like the Circle Line in London, the Ringbahn carries a variety of different S-Bahn services, most of which do not fully circle the ring. That said, more like Berlin, there are services that operate entirely on the ring, known as the S42 and S41. Unlike the various other lines I've talked about in the video so far, as a more mainline scale line, the Ringbahn features more than 2 tracks in many locations to serve both freight and intercity and regional trains. The S-Bahn tracks are super conventional, standard gauge, with a 750 volt third rail. The Ringbahn also has the beautiful Class 483 trains from Stadler and Siemens that I love. Now, before we get to the greatest railway loop line in the world, I have to make some honorable mentions. I'm going to try to do these fast because I have quite a few honorable mentions. The Moscow Central Circle, for showing us that a converted freight loop line can make a great passenger loop line. The Koltsevaya line, also in Moscow, because of its incredibly heavy use and its connections at every single station, including Moscow's main rail terminals. Melbourne and Sydney for creating Chicago-esque rail loops in their city centers, albeit underground and for commuter trains. Glasgow for having a system known as the subway, which makes the deep level tube lines look like they have giant trains, and which literally only consists of a loop line, which honestly, it was a bit debatable whether I should have put it on the list, but Chicago slightly won out. Paris Line 15 for someday providing a high quality circular service around Paris on the Paris Metro with modern steel-wheeled trains that will be a really fresh thing to see, especially for people who don't want to brave the congestion in the city center. That said, this line is a fake loop line, kind of like the Circle Line. The Delhi Pink Line for carrying on the legacy of circular passenger railways in Delhi, but with a modern metro line. And the Copenhagen City Ringen for showing us that even small cities can see the value of circular metro lines that provide high quality transit around the city center. If you've watched my videos for some time, you probably expected the number 1 pick. It's the Yamanote Line in Tokyo. The Yamanote Line is a 34.5 kilometer or 21 mile line with 30 stations serving the Tokyo city center. Tokyo being the largest city on planet Earth. The line moves well in excess of 2 million people every single day. That's more than many of the world's metro systems. The line is operated in part since the late 19th century, though the looping service started in the 1920s. While the Yamanote Line is technically part of the regional JR network that I talked about in my Tokyo Explained video that you should definitely check out, it's really comprehensive, the Yamanote Line would to most people look like a subway. You have stations with platform gates, incredibly subway-like trains, subway-like seating, and super high frequencies. I must say I also love the design of the massive 200+ meter trains. Who says I can't appreciate a well-designed stainless steel train? These trains, like the rest of the JR East urban network in Tokyo, operate on a 1500 volt overhead line on narrow gauge tracks. Now, you might be wondering, what is the key to the massive ridership of the Yamanote Line? And the answer is, the Yamanote Line connects literally all of Tokyo's major railway hubs and destinations, giving it massive circulation potential. The thing you have to understand about Tokyo compared to a lot of other cities in the world is it doesn't really just have one single central business district. It has a sort of core area with tons of hubs like the area around Tokyo Station or Shinagawa or Shinjuku, all of which would make for a giant city center CBD in lots of cities around the world. All of this makes the Yamanote Line the best connected transit line in the world. And if you know anything about the way network effects work, being well connected means lots of riders. Maybe the coolest thing about the Yamanote Line is despite being in the city center, it's basically all above ground, something certain cities like Toronto could learn a lot from. So that's it, the 5 greatest loop railway lines in the world. These were hard to choose, but at the same time, natural picks. That said, I'd love to see your comments on your top loop lines in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.